A girl's husband and mother tried to take away her daughter. After giving birth, the girl's mother and husband tried to deprive her of her parental rights through the court and take away the child. She did not expect such a betrayal from the two people closest to her. Louise has always dreamed of a large family, a cozy home and a happy marriage. She grew up in a small Midwestern town where everyone knew each other by name and family values were paramount. Her parents divorced when she was 8 years old and Louise was left to live with her mother, Karen. Her father left as he couldn't stand his wife's scandalous nature. Even though her father left, Louise always remembered him and looked forward to seeing him, and Karen was angry with her. When Louise turned 23, she met Mark. He was a handsome, kind guy who worked as an engineer for a local company. They started dating and soon Mark asked her to marry him. Louise was over the moon. The wedding was modest but warm, and the couple decided to move into Karen's house, as by then she was having health problems due to alcohol, needed looking after, and Louise didn't want to leave her alone. At first everything seemed perfect. Louise and Mark enjoyed every day they spent together. Karen wasn't very happy about the newlyweds being neighbors in her house. And as time went on, the relationship between Mark and Karen became strained. Karen was always dissatisfied with something and began to interfere in the affairs of the young couple, giving advice on how they should manage the household, raise children, although there were no children yet, and even how to spend their free time. Mark tried to keep calm, but his patience was gradually running out. One evening he came home tired after a long day at work and found Karen sitting in their room with a full glass in her hand, telling Louise off. That was the last straw. "Mom, I appreciate your help, but we're adults," Louise said, trying to lighten the mood. "We can decide for ourselves how we want to live our lives." Karen took offense and went to her room, slamming the door. Mark looked at Louise with bewilderment. "I realize this is your home, but I think your mother is interfering too much in our lives. Maybe we should think about moving out?" Louise sighed. She knew Mark was right, but the thought that if suddenly her mom needed help and she wasn't around, it hurt her. However, she also realized that if they wanted to save their marriage, they needed more privacy. A year and a half passed and Louise found out she was expecting a baby. Joy overflowed her heart. She immediately shared the news with Mark and her mom. Karen was furious. She was going to have a small, screaming baby who demanded more attention than she did. But the closer she got to giving birth, Louise began to feel worse. She developed severe lower abdominal pain, nausea, and dizziness. The doctors said this was normal in pregnancy, but Louise couldn't shake the anxiety. One morning she woke up in severe pain and realized she was losing consciousness. Mark called an ambulance and Louise was rushed to hospital. The diagnosis was scary and unexpected: premature labor. The baby was born premature, but needed intensive care. The following weeks were spent in fear and anxiety. Louise hardly ever left the room of her daughter, who was named Emily. Mark tried to support his wife, but work demanded a lot of his time and he had to go away on frequent business trips. Karen hardly ever showed up. Only sometimes she brought food and clothes and tried to support Louise morally. The doctor said she had complications from the birth and needed to stay in hospital for further treatment. But the longer Louise stayed in hospital, the more she felt that something was going wrong. One evening, as Louise lay on her bed, she heard someone talking quietly in the corridor outside her room. When she opened the door, she saw Mark and Karen. They were talking very quietly about something. Louise stood in the shadows of the room, hesitant to leave it. Something inside her told her that this did not bode well. The next day Louise decided to talk to Mark when he came to check on her. "Mark, I want to know what's going on," she said, trying to hold back her tears. "Why are you and Mom talking so strangely? Are you hiding something from me?" Mark looked up and sighed. He looked confused for a moment, but then he pulled himself together. "Louise, I didn't want to tell you, but I guess it's time. The thing is, Karen and I have decided that while you're recovering, Emily will stay with her. She'll be able to take better care of the baby until you're stronger." Louise felt the world crumble around her. Her child, her little Emily, would grow up away from her and be cared for by her mother, who herself needed looking after? How is that possible? No, no, no. she screamed, unable to believe her ears. "This is my baby. I have to be with him." Mark tried to calm her down, but Louise wouldn't listen. At that moment Karen walked in and Louise rushed to her. "Mommy, why are you doing this?" she sobbed, standing in front of Karen. "How can you take my baby away?" Karen looked at her daughter grinning. "Emily is being discharged and you're staying at the hospital. I think it's best for everyone." But Louise couldn't accept that argument. She felt betrayed and abandoned. In that moment she realized that her world had changed forever. The following days passed in agonizing anticipation. Louise continued to stay in the hospital, but now her thoughts were preoccupied with only one thing: how to get her daughter back. She couldn't believe that Mark and Karen could do this to her. One evening as Louise sat alone in her room, the door opened and a nurse came in. "Mrs. Smith, you have a visitor," she said, smiling. Louise looked up in surprise. She hadn't had a visitor in a long time, except for Mark and her mom. Who could it be? The door opened again and a man entered the room. It was her father, John. Lisa hadn't seen him in years, and her heart clenched with surprise. "Daddy," she whispered, unable to believe her eyes. John came to the bed and gently hugged his daughter. "Hi, my dear," he said, stroking her head. "I'm so sorry I had to leave then. But I was always thinking of you." Louise couldn't hold back her tears. She had waited so long for this moment, hoping that one day Daddy would come back. And here he was, when she needed support the most. "Daddy, what am I going to do?" she asked, sobbing. "They took my daughter. I have nowhere to go and I have to go back to that house. That's where my daughter is. I don't know how to get her back." John listened to her story carefully and nodded thoughtfully. "Let's think together," he said. "First, you must regain your strength. Without health, you can't fight for your right to be a mother." Louise agreed. She knew her father was right. She needed to regain her strength to come home and fight for her child. Months passed before Louise was finally released from the hospital. During this time, she regained her health and got her act together. Her father helped her, supported her, and gave her wise advice. Together they developed a plan of action. The first step was to return home. Louise got there early in the morning when Mark and Karen were still asleep. She quietly opened the door and headed straight for the baby's room. There, in the crib, her baby girl Emily was sleeping peacefully. Louise gently took the little girl in her arms and held her to her chest. Tears of joy and relief flowed down her cheeks. She was finally holding her daughter again. At that moment, Karen entered the room. When she saw Louise with the baby, she stopped on the threshold, not knowing what to say. "I'm back," Lisa said firmly. "And I'm taking my daughter with me." Karen stared at them in silence. "Emily will stay here, Louise," she said. "I think I'm doing the best thing for you." Louise took a deep breath and let the air out through her nose. She realized that right now, with Emily in her arms, it wasn't a good idea to get into a relationship. "It's okay, Mom," she replied, calming down. "Just give me some time to figure all this out." Karen nodded and left the room, leaving her alone with her daughter. After returning home, Louise started a new life. She focused on raising Emily and rebuilding her relationship with Mark. Although trust had been lost, they both tried to work through their problems. However, Louise noticed that Mark had become more withdrawn and distant. He spent less time at home and often stayed late at work. Louise tried to understand what was going on, but Mark avoided frank conversations. One evening, when Mark had gone to work again, Louise received a call from her father. "Louise, I've found something interesting," he said. "It seems that Mark and Karen continue to communicate behind your back." John's words came out of the blue. Louise couldn't believe it, especially after she had openly stated her desire to take control of the situation. Doubt and worry flared up inside her again. "What do you mean, Daddy?" she asked, barely containing the tremor in her voice. "I happened to see them together in town," John explained. "They were standing outside a cafe, talking animatedly. I decided to follow them and heard part of the conversation. It sounded like they were discussing you and Emily. Louise felt her heart start to beat faster. She remembered the encounters and conversations she had seen them have at the hospital, and suddenly everything fell into place. Mark and Karen were clearly still planning something behind her back. "Thanks, Dad," she said, trying to keep her cool. "I'll deal with it." She hung up the phone and took a deep breath. She had to act quickly and decisively. Louise decided it was time to get the truth straight. In the evening, when Mark came home, Louise prepared dinner and invited him to sit down at the table. They ate in silence until she broke the silence. "Mark, I want to talk to you," she began, looking him straight in the eye. "What's going on between you and my mom?" Mark flinched and looked away. "Nothing to worry about," he mumbled, but his uncertainty betrayed the lie. "Don't deceive me, Mark," Louise insisted. "I know that you continue to meet in the city. What are you hiding?" Mark lowered his head and sighed. Finally, he spoke. "Louise, I love you, but your mom has offered me to stay with her if you don't recover from your illness. She promised to help with Emily, to give us both stability and comfort. I didn't want to agree, but..." Those words stabbed Louise in the heart. She couldn't believe that Mark had even considered the possibility. But at the same time she realized that his weakness and insecurity had played their part. "So you were willing to leave me for comfort?" she asked, barely holding back her tears. Mark was silent, unable to find the words. His silence spoke for itself. Louise realized that it was time to make a decision. She could no longer trust Mark and her mother, and it was impossible for her to continue living with them. She needed to protect herself and her daughter. Karen was always at her side, as if she could sense what she was up to. The next morning she packed up her things and, taking Emily in her arms, went to her father's house. John met them at the car with joy and relief. He realized that Louise needed support and help. "You made the right decision, Louise," he said as he hugged her. "Now you can start again." Lisa moved in with her father and began to build a new life. She found a job at a local store to support herself and Emily. John helped her with the baby girl, giving her a chance to rest and recuperate. Time passed and Louise gradually gained confidence in her abilities. She learned to cope on her own and realized that she could be a good mother without help. Meanwhile, Mark and Karen tried to contact Louise, but she ignored their calls and messages. She knew she needed time to heal and move on. A few months later, Louise received a letter from a lawyer. It turned out that Mark had filed for divorce and claimed custody of Emily. Louise was shocked by this news, but she wasn't going to give up without a fight. She contacted her attorney and began preparing for trial. During the trial, it emerged that Mark and Karen were indeed living together and were planning to take Emily. Lisa's attorney presented evidence of their relationship and plans for the child. The judge listened carefully to both sides and made a decision. Given the circumstances and Louise's desire to raise her daughter, the court left Emily with her. Mark was granted visitation rights, but Louise retained full custody. This decision was a huge relief for Louise. She was finally able to breathe freely and feel like her life was getting back to normal. As the years passed, Louise fully rebuilt her life. She continued to work and raise Emily, who grew up to be a healthy and happy little girl. John remained an important part of their lives, supporting Louise in everything. Louise tried not to see Mark, except for moments when he visited his daughter. She never saw Karen again, preferring to stay away from those who had caused her so much pain. She realized that true strength lies in the ability to forgive and move forward no matter what. Her story became an example of how important it is to believe in yourself and fight for your happiness, even when it seems like the whole world is against you.